Colleagues and friends, welcome. My name's John Williams. I'll be emceeing and doing some other things today. I'd like to acknowledge all the very distinguished guests here today, including the Minister, who will also acknowledge them. Just the housekeeping moment, if you could turn your phones to silent. And this session will be recorded and photographed, so if you're not comfortable with this, please make yourself known to the History Trust and its staff and the photographers. And I should welcome you on behalf of the History Trust of South Australia. I'd now like to move, if we could, to the very important moment of our Welcome to Country, and it's with immense pleasure that I invite Cliffy Wilsons from Kumakara to the lectern. Please welcome Cliffy.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon to you all. How's everyone doing today? Doing well? That's good to hear. Before I get into Welcome to Country, I always like to take the opportunity to start by saying that it's an absolute honour for me to be here, to have this opportunity to provide a Welcome to Country and to represent the Kaurna community, the traditional custodians here at the Adelaide region, but also to represent Kumakara Cultural Services, which is an organisation that I work for. And on a daily basis, I'm very fortunate to be able to showcase language and culture throughout the Adelaide CBD and surrounding suburbs covering Kaurna country. And I'm also a part of the first generation of my family to have been able to start to relearn the Kaurna language and connect back with culture. So always an honour to be here to represent my family as well. I'd now like to welcome you in the language of the Kaurna people, and I want to start by saying, Mani Tawu, Nyankina Mena, Na Mani. Mani. Nai Cliffy Tangku, Munaitya Wilson, Nagana, Naranjiri, Narunga, Nadri, Arandamiyu. Maruichanga Gana Miona, Nado Tampandi, Nalugani Tanga Tikandi. Nawanga di Mani the Budnigani Yatana, Naichu Yakandalia, Naichalia. So to translate that, once again, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cliffy Wilson, but down here on Kaurna country, my traditional names are Tangku and Munaitya. So as always, I'd like to take a moment to explain about those names so you all have an understanding of what they are and what they mean to me. The first one, Tangku, is my individual totem. And our totems in communities across the country can range from native plants and trees we have in this country, native animals, or even some of the tools and artefacts that we've created over time. And our role is to then become the protector of whatever that may be. So I was given an animal, so just a few rules that I have to go by. I can't hunt, kill, or eat that animal. And if I was to see it sick or injured, I'd have to help nurture it back to health. But as I always say, when I was having a discussion with my elders many years ago to get my totem, we forgot to sit down and talk a little bit about my safety, because they thought it was a good idea to give me Tangku, which is actually the king brown snake, one of the most dangerous animals in the country. So I say they kind of threw me under the bus with that one, but you know, we'll have to deal with that, won't we? But Munaitya is also my birth order name, so when a mother on Kaurna country has given birth to children, they're all given a birth order name, and Munaitya for me, it translates to the fourth born and male of my family. So my family are proud Kaurna people from here in the Adelaide Plains, and we're also proud Naranjiri people from back on the lower lakes of the Coorong. But I do have very strong family connection back to the Narunga people, which is on the Yorke Peninsula, the Nadri people heading out to the mid-north of South Australia, and also the Aranda people, which is actually in the Northern Territory in Alice Springs. I'd like to say welcome to today's Bambambalya, which translates to conference or event, and may we recognise that we are gathered on the lands of the Kaurna people. I would like to recognise this part of the country that we're standing on today, the Adelaide CBD. For many, many years, it was a very significant area for the Kaurna people, which we refer to as Tarandanyanga. So Tarandanyanga is made up of two words in the Kaurna language, and I would like to teach you these two words today because it was made up of two words that were very significant to the Kaurna people. So firstly, we had Taranda. Can you all say that one? Taranda. Beautiful. So for those who might not know what Taranda is, it is the big red male kangaroo, and it's a totem down here for the Kaurna people. But we also believe that Taranda had given us our law and our protocols down here on Kaurna country that we've abided by for many years and still do today. But the second half of that word is Ganya. Can we say that one? Lovely. So Ganya is a rock or a stone, and many, many years ago, there was a large rock located down by the River Torrens, or as we call it, Katarerapari, which translates to Red Gum River, where the Kaurna community would go to perform their traditional ceremonies around that rock. You won't see it today. It was quarried down many, many years ago. However, they did use it to help build the foundations for a lot of the older churches and buildings that are still standing throughout the Adelaide CBD today. But this area was also a big camping ground for the Kaurna people as well. So as I said, very significant area for many, many years. But when we combine those two words, it becomes Tarandanyanga, which then translates to Big Red Kangaroo Rock, or we'd also refer to it as the dreaming place of the Big Red Kangaroo. So may we pay respects to the cultural and spiritual beliefs of the Kaurna people and recognise that their continuous connection to the land, the sky, and the waterways that surround and connect us are still as strong, still as important, and just as resourceful to the living Kaurna people today. I would like to pay respects to my elders past, present and emerging, and always give a special thank you to those who paved the way for me to be able to stand here today to speak my traditional language and welcome you all here, not only to Kaurna country, but to a place that many people from many parts of the world and many cultural backgrounds now refer to as home. So firstly, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities from across the country and those who may be in attendance with us today, but also recognise the many different religions, traditions and cultural backgrounds we have not only in this room but across the country of Australia today. I'd now like to finish off by saying Ngāchalia and Nakada. Ngāchalia means thank you in the Kaurna language, so thank you to staff and organisers for giving me a platform here today to represent the Kaurna community and showcase some of the local language of the Kaurna people. But thank all of you for your time, your attention and respect. I really appreciate that. And thanks for engaging in the language. Hopefully I was able to teach you a little bit about this traditional area and its name and where it comes from, but hopefully teach you a couple of new words today as well. But also want to say Nakada, which means we'll see you again when our paths meet. So enjoy the rest of the afternoon and I'm sure I'll see you again soon. Ngāchalia, Nakada.
Thank you very much, Cliffy. And it is a very important thing that we are welcome to country, and we enjoy you always doing so. So now my honour to introduce the Minister, the Honourable Blair Boyer, Minister for Education, Training and Skills. Blair lives in the north-eastern suburbs of Adelaide with his wife and 3 lovely daughters. He grew up in a small farming rural in south-west Victoria, not far from Mount Gambier. He was elected to represent the state electorate of Wright in 2018. He was appointed the Minister after the March 2022 election. Blair is passionate, as we know, about education and has been a strong advocate for public education and the equality that it brings to our community. Please welcome the Minister.
Thank you very much, John, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Could I just thank Cliffy for his welcome to country and also acknowledge that we're all gathered on Kaurna land this afternoon, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Could I acknowledge Kai Ma, Deputy Premier of South Australia and the Attorney-General, Nat Cook, who is representing the Premier Peter Malinaskis, the Minister for Human Services. We have some representatives from the History Trust of South Australia here as well. Justina Yocum, the Chief Executive, Michael Neal, the Chair, Anne Levy, a very well-known and long-serving former member of the Legislative Council in this place, and of course members of the panel as well. Ian Hunter, Chris Sumner AM, and Jodeen Carney, the Commissioner for Equal Opportunity, and also the Chair, John. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share a few short words with you. It is, I have to say, humbling to be, the Minister who gets to come along and speak about such a momentous, milestone as 50 years since the decrim of homosexuality in this state. I still remember, it would have been, I reckon, about 1995. My dad, and as you heard from John, I grew up in a small country area on the other side of the border. But Dad had a few political biographies that he kept on a shelf in his study. One of those was a very old one about Don Dunstan. And I remember him pulling it down and telling me that this was one that I absolutely had to read. And that was kind of an uncommon thing because 1970s, even then in 1995, to someone who was 15 years old, felt a very, very long time ago. And everything, I know people in here that will pain them, but it seemed like all those things happened so long ago. But I still remember being struck at the things that this, handsome-looking kind of trailblazing Premier did. And the mid-90s in Victoria were a kind of tough time politically, and I remember thinking, why does South Australia get to have these progressive kind of premiers? Why doesn't Victoria get that? It must have taken so much courage for him to do the things that he did, and it's had a really impression upon me. And I just say that because there are people in this room who are part of those battles to get this reform that we are here to acknowledge today. And of course, I am grateful to have the opportunity to speak for you, but I acknowledge that really I am fortunate to be one who comes along after all that hard work has been done, but to offer my words of thanks, and why acknowledging the occasion I think is so important given what's happening in the world today, and particularly within the lens of what we're doing in education to make sure young people understand about some of these reforms and what they have meant to their lives. And we know that global political affairs and debate are in a pretty parlous position at the moment. It's kind of ugly out there, particularly on social media. Events just of the last few weeks, I think everything feels like it's on a bit of a knife's edge. And I think it's a really, really timely reminder, not so much to the people in this room, because I think the people in this chamber understand how hard fought these reforms were, and I'll talk about Dr. Duncan a little bit later, but particularly to the younger generation, that you can't take those kind of social reforms for granted, even ones that occurred 50 years ago. And we are seeing things that were very much on the fringe in terms of views held by people, political positions, are now, for inexplicable reasons, part of the mainstream, and things that young people in particular are bombarded with through social media every day, absolutely bombarded. And we're seeing the effect that it has through things like toxic masculinity and other things like that are having a real world effect in our schools, in our households, in the way that people relate to other people. And I think today's acknowledgement of the anniversary of 50 years is really, aside from doing what is the right thing to do and acknowledge the work of people who fought for it, the people who put legislation up to make that change and were unsuccessful but kept at it. It's also to use this 50-year anniversary as an opportunity to teach young people about the courageous things that people did, and in the case of Dr. Duncan actually losing his life, to have the kind of freedoms that people enjoy today. That's the first part of it. The second part, of course, is getting people to understand and putting the lens of what's happening in global politics over that, and understanding that you can't take it for granted. This is a lesson in not being able to take things like this for granted. And there's no more powerful example, I don't think, than the decriminalisation of homosexuality in South Australia. And I'm sure the panel will get into the detail, and I'll be fascinated to hear about the things that sort of went on kind of behind the scenes to make that happen. There are always obviously, in terms of the things that happen in this place and in the other place, things that don't make it into the public realm that were key kind of things that occurred to make enormous reforms like this a natural reality. And I was reminded of this recently in reading a bit of South Australian history about, we often talk about how proud we are as being one of the first places to give women not just the right to vote, but the right to run for Parliament. But of course, the second part of that was an attempt by those who were trying to make sure that women didn't get the right to vote at all, in destroying that by adding in that they could also run for Parliament, and inadvertently gave women both those rights at the same time. But it was not their intention to do that, of course. It was their intention to do probably something very similar to what was done with the referendum in 1999 and destroy the whole debate. But I'll be fascinated to hear what the panel has to say about how these things came to be. I'll just finish by saying too, it's important for us to remember the foundation that change made for a whole heap of other legislation that came after it, including more recently. I'm thinking about things like the Sex Discrimination Act, Equal Opportunity Act, again, something that we just take for granted now, but was another reform in this state that was hard fought and won, and more recently, the Conversion Practices Prohibition Act. And I reckon that sometimes the trick in terms of forming your position when you are a member of Parliament or a community leader or an advocate for these kind of missions is trying to put yourselves as best you can in the shoes of those people who will come after you, and how will they view the decisions you have made. And I think we look back at things like the Sex Discrimination Act, the Equal Opportunity Act, the Decriminalisation of Homosexuality, and although now they seem like such obvious things to do, no doubt they weren't at the time, and I'm sure the same will apply to things like Conversion Practices Prohibition Act as well. When those who reflect upon the last few years in Parliament in future years will look back and wonder why it took us so long to do things like that. But it is my real privilege and honour to be able to come along and offer my word of thanks, particularly those who made all sorts of incredible sacrifices and took all sorts of incredibly courageous steps in the face of what must have been pretty vehement and very public criticism, which I think would be a very difficult thing to deal with on a personal level, who have laid the foundation for us to be here today celebrating 50 years since the decriminalisation, but who also laid the foundation for a whole heap of other progressive social reforms that this state has made. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. Now, I'll make some introductions of our speakers and then we'll commence this conversation. So, for our speaker I'd start with, Jodeen Carney is the Commissioner for Equal Opportunities, we heard. Jodeen began her career in the Northern Territory, which, as we know, was part of South Australia to that unpleasantness in 1911, where she worked as a lawyer, a politician, a department chief executive and a consultant. She moved to South Australia and she worked as the Chief of Staff of the former Attorney General and Deputy Premier Vicky Chapman, who was, as we know, the first woman to hold those roles and was known for her progressive views on law reform. Jodeen has been appointed to the South Australia's Commissioner of Equal Opportunity in April 2021 for a 5-year term, and late last year, with her team, she conducted a review of harassment in the South Australian legal profession. She's also an accredited mediator. The Honourable Ian Hunter MLC. Ian, as we know, is a member of the Legislative Council, so welcome to the other place in South Australia. He's attended Flinders University where he studied microbiology and genetics. While at university, Ian became the president of the Flinders University Gay Society and helped found the South Australian AIDS Action Coalition, which was later renamed South Australian AIDS Council. He was instrumental in the success of including sexuality as a grounds of discrimination in the Equal Opportunity Act of 1984. He was our first openly gay member of the South Australian Parliament. We're talking about courage. Ian continued to advocate for LGBTI A+ issues, including same-sex marriage, gender-affirming care and the banning of conversion practices. And our last speaker tonight is the Honourable Chris Sumner. Chris served as a member of the South Australian Legislative Council for 19 years from 1975, 11 of those as Attorney General. He's held numerous ministerial portfolios, including the Minister for Ethnic Affairs. He initiated and to advance the development of multiculturalism here in South Australia. As Attorney General, he was responsible for many reforms, numerous reforms, including the development of policies concerning the victims of crime. After leaving politics, he spent 17 years as a member of the Australia's National Native Title Tribunal, and he continues to be involved, as many of us know, in legal, political and constitutional matters through his media and publications. So, colleagues, that's our lineup for today. So let me just start by welcoming you to this building, which has contributed significantly to the history of this state and indeed the Commonwealth. Critical debates about the nature of our society have taken place inside these chambers and indeed on the steps outside these chambers. Tonight we're returning to a place 50 years ago this Parliament considered one of the fundamental themes of our society, and that is the role of law in regulating relationships between individuals and the state. As the founding director of the South Australian Law Reform Institute, it's been my privilege to work with governments of all political hues on references relating to the removal of discrimination in our laws off the statute books, surrogacy law reform, vulnerable witnesses law reform, abortion, provocation, including removing the so-called gay panic and adult safeguarding. I'd like to spend our time tonight doing the sweep of history, starting with the events prior to 1975, but also looking forward about asking the questions of what is yet to be done. So let me start by looking at the 1960s, and though our speakers were all too young to be there, I'm sure they've read about it. I'd like to contextualise the period just before the 1972 and 1975 votes. The decade before, in 1975, the Menzies government had been in power since 1949. 1965, the Playford era had come to an end after 26 years. Adelaide had a population of about 850,000. So my question to the panel, how would you describe South Australia in the 1960s as we entered that 1970s? I want to understand what was going on and what was about to happen. So who would like to start off? Ian.
Well, John, I was still in primary school, so I can't really give you much of a commentary about the state at the time. I guess I can tell you a little bit about my own personal view of the world, but I can't really throw back to the 60s. I don't have a lot of memories of the 60s at all, but in the early 70s up to 72, I can remember as a 12-year-old boy reading the front page of the Advertiser and seeing that this Dr. Duncan got thrown in the river and killed, and obviously that he was gay. It was a very easy thing to read in the paper. At 12, I had no idea that I was homosexual. I just knew I liked boys. I also knew it was something I shouldn't talk about, and I knew it was something that would get me into deep, deep trouble if I did. And so I was very uneasy about that period, very uneasy about what was happening out in the world of South Australia, but my world was pretty concentrated around Holden Hill and Durnan Court Primary School and Gillis Plains High School. I don't really have a lot of recollection. Prior to that, I knew I was scared. I knew every day going to school I was petrified that I would be exposed as one of those others who got beaten up by the cops or other people or even murdered. And I knew I had to keep silent. I was afraid every day of my life as a 12-year-old boy.
Thank you very much. Chilling. Chris, do you have a view of the 1960s as we're moving into this 1972 period?
Well, 1965, the Labor government was elected after, as you said, 23 but almost 30 years of Liberal rule. Sir Tom Playford was a very important figure in South Australia's history, concentrating particularly on economic development, migration, diversity of the industrial base of South Australia, but he was not particularly interested in social reform. He had a terrible gerrymander, which was an affront to human rights at the time, and but Labor came in 1965 with a fairly aggressive agenda. Don Dunstan was obviously a part of a lot of that. But the other thing that happened after Playford is that there emerged within the Liberal Party a younger breed of what I call small L Liberals who eventually formed the Liberal movement and caused a split in the Liberal Party in the early 1970s. I mention them because they are critical to what actually happened with the homosexual law reform bill, and without their involvement, and in particular that of Murray Hill in the Legislative Council, it is unlikely that what happened at the time would have happened at all. But particularly, I don't think any of it would have happened at that time in 72 if it hadn't been for the killing of Dr. Duncan, which was the primary motivating event. But from a broad perspective, South Australia was emerging from a period of not very active legislation in the social area, in fact, virtually none. There were limitations on gambling, pubs closed at 6 o'clock, and this was about to change with the Labor government, with Don Dunstan, but elements of it were supported by the Liberal Party, not all the Liberal Party, but elements within the Liberal Party who I describe as small L Liberals who had an affinity for some aspects of social reform, including abortion law reform that occurred in 1969 under the Hall government with Robin Millhouse as Attorney General. So that's the context that we come into.
Thank you very much. Jodeen, do you want to talk about maybe the 60s as a time of reform generally, or...?
Well, I should disclose I was born in 65, so I wasn't actively politically or socially engaged. However, like Blair, my family was from Victoria, and they were a pretty progressive family, and in my view still are. So Don Dunstan was famous in our household from across the border. As Equal Opportunity Commissioner, I know, although I knew this without being Commissioner, that the 60s and the 70s were really just such an important time, both in this state, in this country and elsewhere, for the recognition of what we regard as fundamental human rights, whether it's about race, gender, sexuality and so on. The 60s and the 70s were a movement of which I'm a beneficiary, and I think many of us are beneficiaries. And the advantages of the celebrations of this year is that for younger people in particular, and I work with young people and they're great, but I have this sense that they just think everything's magically happened. Yeah. Well, it's the hard work of people around this room, their strategic lobbying, their commitment and their courage, both pollies and non-pollies, who have effected certainly legislative change and aided social change. So I'm in awe of the 60s and 70s and I'm very grateful for them.
Thank you very much. Let's move to the 10th of May 1972. It is a pivot date. So we're not far from this place to where Dr. Ian George Ogilvie Duncan was aged 41. He disembarked from the SS Orchids on the 22nd of March 1972 and was dead on the 10th of May 1972. I mean, you think about that. The man just arrived amongst us. He was a victim, as the English police investigators concluded, of, quote, a high-spirited frolic gone wrong. An appalling conclusion.
Merely.
Yes, merely. So the life and death of Dr. Duncan has been the subject, and Ian's already talked about this, of large research, but Ian, do you want to expand a little bit more on what you heard or what you felt when you heard of the death of Dr. Duncan?
Sure. Well, you know, homosexuality wasn't on the front page of the paper normally, or in the TV. The number 96 hadn't yet happened, which was my awakening, my mirror onto a bigger world. Most people don't know about number 96. I'll talk to you about it later on. It was a pivotal TV show in Australia's history. But it did break into the paper. It did break into TV news in the evening, and it did start to have discussions happening more openly around the dinner table about those poofters. And that discussion never really happened otherwise. If it happened, it wasn't around the dinner table. It certainly wasn't inside the house. And as I said, just starting to realise what I was at that time, and then to be hit with the fact that poofters get drowned and murdered ostensibly or allegedly from members of the police force, the people who are supposed to look after you and protect you, was a bit of an eye-opener. As I say, it really was a shock and a wake-up call for me. At 12 years old, I didn't really understand much about what was happening, but I knew it spoke to me, and I knew it said to me, you are not safe, and you have to be very, very quiet about these feelings you're starting to have, because they're not going to be welcomed, certainly not at my household dinner table, certainly not at school, and certainly not in public. But the key thing about Duncan, on reflection, is this. There were community activity right around the country on decriminalisation in every state. Sydney, New South Wales and Victoria were way ahead of us in terms of activism and community campaigning, but they didn't break through, we did. And I think the reason was, as Blair said, was because we had this horrendous murder. And not just some old poofter, but in fact, an Adelaide University law professor, a member of the establishment, someone that the chaps up in the upper house from the Adelaide Club would have welcomed as one of their own. And that was a wake-up call which really, I think, incited this push of shame in some of the decision-makers in our community and parliamentarians about, gosh, we need to do something about this. Without the martyrdom of Duncan, we would not probably have been the first state in Australia to actually change our laws.
Thank you very much. Chris, do you remember when you heard about Duncan's?
Not specifically, but I wasn't in Parliament in 1972, but I was in Adelaide in the law profession, so I knew generally about it, and it became pretty clear very early in the piece. Although the police hierarchy initially didn't want to believe that police officers were involved, it didn't take that long for them to realise that there was suspicion of involvement of the police officers, and that's why the Scotland Yard group, the two detectives from Scotland Yard were brought in. And I think really from the moment they made their report, we've known pretty well what happened. The way they expressed the conclusion that it was merely a frolic that had gone wrong, we would find highly offensive, quite properly highly offensive these days. But they're finding that the three police officers, members of the vice squad off duty, who'd come away from a farewell party for one of their colleagues, were responsible, was, I think, their conclusion, and really there is no other conclusion. So I'd perhaps like to take that a little bit further as well. And so I think we're a bit coy these days about saying, well, this is an unsolved crime. It's only technically unsolved. I think the Scotland Yard officers got it right in terms of their conclusion. The report was eventually released by Michael Atkinson, the Labor Attorney General. And of course, when I was Attorney General, three of the police officers were charged. Two of them were put up before a jury, charged with manslaughter. It was not a matter of murder. Put up before a jury, but both were acquitted. But there is still, surprisingly enough, a reward notice out for $200,000 for information about the death of Dr. Duncan. But to me, it just seems to be almost a sort of false hope that could happen. It's a bit misleading to have a reward being offered for something where we know pretty certainly what happened, and where the people who were the perpetrators can no longer be convicted. But it still sits there. But I think it adds unnecessarily to the sort of drama of the moment to say that this is an unsolved case. It is unsolved in the sense that no one was convicted. But I think 50 years down the track, we shouldn't be coy about really saying what we know happened as a result of the Scotland Yard report, which has been made public. The fact is, it was the police officers. They were off duty, they were at a party, they engaged in appalling behaviour. This wasn't their official duty of provoking homosexuals to entrapment and that sort of thing. This was just what they regarded, and the police officers, the Scotland Yard people, found as a frolic, and merely a frolic. Now, it's an appalling way of putting, but that's what it was, and I don't think we should hide behind that anymore 50 years down the track, even though there is this sort of rather odd thing out there, a reward notice of $200,000 for providing information which couldn't take the matter any further and certainly couldn't lead to any conviction because they've already been acquitted.
Yeah. Look, I will probably keep moving on if I could. We heard that the Murray Hill brought in an attempt and a partial decriminalisation in 1970.
No, that's not actually accurate.
He brought in legislation.
Yes, yeah, but it's not accurate to say that it was only partial decriminalisation.
I said it created offence.
No, it's wrong.
Well, okay, I'm just mindful of the time. I've also...
Two lawyers arguing,
Yes,
it could take forever.
Well, no, hang on. No, I'm sorry, this is critical.
Okay, well, please.
Well, what happened was that Don Dunstan in 1965 got approval to implement the Wolfenden recommendation, which was the decriminalisation of homosexuality in 1957, the UK report. In the end, the caucus and the cabinet got cold feet, and John got cold feet as well, and he made a political decision not to proceed with it in 1965. The bill that Murray Hill introduced, which was only 2 months after the killing of Dr. Duncan, was to implement the Wolfenden Committee's report. It was amended in the upper house to, in effect, maintain the offence, the homosexual offence, but provide a defence if there was the actions occurred in private and between and with consent.
And
So that was
only two people.
And only two people.
Yeah.
So that was
Kind of limiting, I think.
They were the amendments. They were the amendments.
Imagination, really.
They were the amendments that were introduced in the upper house and passed in the upper house. They were not Murray Hill's bill.
No.
And often, I'm not sure whether you
Look,
got me wrong about this.
No,
but
no.
Often it is said, and this really needs to be put straight. Often it is said that the Murray Hill bill was what it was the bill that was amended in the upper house. It was not. The Murray Hill bill was for full decriminalisation based on the Wolfenden report. And the lower house, where the matter was debated, overwhelmingly supported the original Murray Hill bill. It was reinserted in the lower house, the Murray Hill amendments. It went back to the upper house. The upper house rejected them again. Then they came back to the lower house, and the lower house had to make a very, very critical decision, which Don Dunstan was involved in as well. They could have sent it back to the upper house, and it's possible that the bill, the Murray Hill bill, would have failed totally, and the De Garis bill might have, the amendments might have failed totally as well. In the House of Assembly, Don Dunstan and David Tonkin, who had the carriage of it, no doubt in consultation with Murray Hill, decided they were better to accept the amendments made by De Garis for the defence provision, rather than lose the bill totally. So Don Dunstan actually, well, with Tonkin, as I said, and Murray Hill, they agreed that they would not push the issue with the upper house. So it's important, I think, to realise, because I've heard it, and it's almost entered the folklore that Murray Hill's bill was the one that was amended. It wasn't. Murray Hill bill was actually for the decriminalisation, the same bill that Don tried to get approval for in 1965 but wasn't prepared to proceed with.
It's also important to note, Chris, that this was before the upper house was reformed.
Yes.
You know, it had a massive majority of LCL and Liberal members. I don't know how many Labor members we had, like 2 or 3?
Well, we had 4 at that
Four?
stage.
And the Liberals had what? The rest?
Well, 16.
16, that's right. So it wasn't a question of going back and trying to seek extra numbers, it was just an impossibility.
Well, the question was...
Chris, I want to try and move on to...
Yeah, no, sure.
So
and I just thought that needed...
No, we know there was reform in 72. It wasn't as far as it could have been, as far-reaching as it might be. So let's move to 75 then. And of course, 75, things don't happen in isolation. There was political leadership of the Duncan government. There was campaigns... Dunstan, sorry, of the campaign against moral persecution, the CAMP and the gay activist group. Many of those people were here tonight.
There's Will back there.
I was pointing in his way. Peter Duncan was known as Attorney General introduced legislation. It was piloted through the upper house by the Honourable.
Sorry, he wasn't Attorney General.
Wasn't Attorney General.
He was a backbencher.
It was piloted through the upper house by the Honourable Levy in September 1975. What's the significance of the reform, Ian?
Well, God, it was an Australian first. The other interesting thing, which often is overlooked, it was the first time, certainly in the Westminster system, possibly in a large part of the world, where there was an equal age of consent. So even in the UK, after the Wolfenden report, there are different ages of consent for heterosexuals and homosexuals. Homosexuals was 21, I think heterosexuals was 16 or 17, something like that. So we were a pioneer in that area. But again, I'll go back to what it felt like for me. So I was 15, all grown up by then. Not 12 anymore. Man of the world, knew what was going on, and still scared to go to school every single day. But for me, it was like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I felt, as a young 15-year-old, that there was no future for me in this state, or no future for me anywhere. You know, I was growing up to be a criminal. That's what faced me. And then this stuff happened all around me in the media, in a frenzy. 1996, number 96 had been on the TV for 2 years. And I was very well educated by that, with Don and Dudley, teaching me about healthy homosexual lifestyles. But I thought I had to go to Sydney for that. Yes. And then decriminalisation happened, and I realised I'm no longer going to be arrested as a criminal. I didn't realise at the time that I could still be arrested for indecent behaviour, but that's what happened to a lot of people. You weren't arrested for homosexual behaviour, you got arrested for something else. But nonetheless, a huge weight dropped from my shoulders, and I felt, at last, I can be a normal human being again. I also knew that I still couldn't talk about it. I can remember my grandmother talking to one of her sisters over afternoon tea when this was happening, and it was being discussed at afternoon tea time with a neighbour and one of her sisters, and talking about Don Dunstan and poofters and his shorts and this legislation. And I can remember her saying, God, if I ever found out one of my kids was like this, I'd shoot myself. And I thought, well, okay, I better keep that to myself for a few more years till I manage to move out of home. But again, for me personally, it was a massive change. And it's like the sun had come up, and I felt like there was a future for me after all. But of course, it kicked off the next 40 years of legislative change and the change within society. I joined the Labor Party in 1983. It wasn't the happy show that it is these days in terms of social policy, and it was a struggle. But change was happening, reform was happening. Anne Levy was at the forefront of some of that in her vexatious activities inside the Labor Party, leaving the progressive policy group that she formed. Things had started to roll and change was on the way. And other changes were happening in society at the same time, of course. Protests about the Vietnam War, protests about apartheid, and there was a sense of great movement. And then on the federal scene, of course, you had Gough Whitlam and that great experiment, and free education, which I benefited from and a lot of my generation did. So change was about, it was bubbling, it was fermenting, it was happening all around, and this happened right in the very middle and gave me great hope.
Let's take on this point of change, Jodeen, if I could. So often the law is either endorsing a norm that we all believe in, or it's endorsing a change that the community's already made and catching it up. And so I'm really asking the question, what is the role of leadership in this question? Or is it really the community that drives politicians reluctantly to the solution? So who's the agents of change?
I think both, and particular circumstances and causes, you'll see one playing a greater role than the other. But I think political leadership is really, it is the most essential thing to effect change. And Ian has talked about the effects of change on him. I was a gay woman from Victoria who went to the Northern Territory. I was okay, but it was much harder for Ian. Making a difference in people's lives, and we're lucky we have 3 ministers here tonight. That's why they're in their jobs. That's what they aim to do. That's what all the good people in politics aim to do. Some, however, are more resistant than others for political reasons or just by way of their personalities, and it requires the community members to be strategic and effective advocates. My view is that, for the most part, once politicians see that there is a good idea, that it has benefits, that it also benefits them because they can announce it, they're like rats up a drain pipe. Nevertheless, there are, my view is also that many good politicians are champions of change, and that's leadership in its most pure form, in my view, and that's clearly what happened here.
Well, again, I think we need to go back to the nuance of history that I tried to introduce at the beginning. Don Dunstan was an idol to me. One of the reasons I joined the Labor Party. He was certainly charismatic, courageous. He was principled. But in this issue, it is important to understand that Don was not very active, in fact, in the 1970s in publicly advocating for homosexual law reform. He supported the Murray Hill Bill, as I explained, and then nothing more was done about it until Peter Duncan decided to take it up in 1973. And as Peter has said in his recent memoir, this was not a government bill, so it wasn't a Dunstan government bill. It was a conscience vote, and Don had nothing to do with the drafting, but Peter makes this point. Now, Don supported it, there's no doubt about that, and worked behind the scenes, but it's important to remember that with the Dunstan government, a lot of things get attributed to Dunstan that are not necessarily completely accurate, and there are plenty of other examples of that. Undoubtedly, it was an important area of reform, but in this particular case, Don in 1965 decided not to proceed with it. The government didn't proceed with it after the death of Dr. Duncan. Murray Hill decided to proceed with it, and then Peter Duncan took it up as a private member's bill in 1973 when he was a backbencher. And this again is a fact that's often not correctly stated in the various biographies that have been written. Peter Duncan was not Attorney General when he introduced the decriminalisation bill in 1975. He was still a backbencher, and it went through when he was a backbencher and before he became the Attorney General. In my view, the critical debate about this issue occurred in 1972 in the Parliament at that time. And in the lower house at that time, there was overwhelming support for the Wolfenden Committee recommendations for decriminalisation. Overwhelming support, and that was the case all the way through. So it was only the problem in the upper house. There were problems in 1973. By 1975, there were 6 Labor members elected to Legislative Council, including me, and with support of Murray Hill and some other Liberals, there were then the numbers to get the decriminalisation through. But it wasn't actually a Dunstan government initiative, although it's often said to be one of Don Dunstan's initiatives. He supported it, certainly. He certainly wanted it. But it's more nuanced. It was actually a Team SA proposal where I'll call them small L Liberals, for want of a better word, were critical. David Tonkin, Murray Hill, Martin Cameron and others were critical to getting this through. And the broad support that there was right from 1972 in the lower house meant that once the political situation had changed in the upper house and the old legislative councillors from the Playford era had gone, the bill was going to get through. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. This was in the upper house as well. In 1975, there was Don Laidlaw, who was the father of Diana Laidlaw, who was there with Anne and I later. And he was also, I guess, a small L Liberal. He supported the homosexual law reform as well. So I think that context is very important, and often you don't see it.
Thank you very much. Look, we're getting terribly close to time, but I want to really push forward, if I could, and really ask the question, what is to be done? What is the next thing? And this is really a question about how we bring about change, but what is the proposed law reform? So I'll ask Makers, what is the thing we have to do next?
Okay, well, that's a big question. There are a few bits of legislation that still need to be tidied up. Not small bits, some of them are particularly in relation to employers in the education area, private schools, which have a carve-out in our legislation, in the Equal Opportunity Act. They can still hire and fire people on the basis of their sexuality. They can fire a gardener. They can fire a secretary, a cleaner. It doesn't have to be a teaching staff. That is an outlier that's been there for a long time, nearly 45 years, I think. And I think that needs to be looked at again. I know people are saying the feds are going to fix that, and there will be then this contest between state and federal law, but we've been waiting for that to happen as well. So that's something that's still on the agenda, and that's in the too hard basket. Going after private schools is a pretty big ask, but I think it's something we need to have a conversation about. But in the larger space, from my perspective, I think we need to look, and I chaired recently a committee of the Social Development Committee of Parliament looking at whether South Australia should adopt a Human Rights Act to pull together all of the various rights that are in bill, or in bills, I should say, as opposed to common law, and bring it into one space, into one act. And the committee comprised a very mixed bunch, 3 Labor, 2 Liberals and 1 Green, and we unanimously supported a recommendation to Parliament to actually have a Human Rights Act, but with a couple of caveats, one after a very large bit of work in terms of taking the community along on the consultation process about whether it's required and what it should look like and what rights should be included. I think that's the big piece of work that awaits us. Other states have got it, Victoria's got it, ACT has got it, Queensland's got one, and of course the feds have got one. So I think that's where we should be focusing our activities into the future.
Thank you very much. Jodeen.
I think the feds want one.
Oh, they haven't got it yet?
Well, some feds do and some feds don't. In any case,
They've got a report that recommends it.
they do.
Yeah.
For me, as EO Commissioner, and Kaya Maher is here and we've talked about this over the last little while, the Equal Opportunity Act needs a review. And not being a native of South Australia, I can say with impunity that, yes, South Australians are really proud of what they've done, and that's great, but your Equal Opportunity Act, our Equal Opportunity Act of 1984, has been reviewed once, and that was 30 years ago. When places like my old patch, the Northern Territory, has a much more progressive equal opportunity or anti-discrimination framework in South Australia, I think all of us would think, oh dear. And in the course of, should there be a review, then I think consideration could be given to a Human Rights Act. But for me, as Commissioner, I think an act that reflects a modern community and the needs and wishes and aspirations of people in it is really important. We have 14 what we call our protected attributes, and the government, sensibly in my view, I think Nat and Kyan were both involved in bringing in domestic violence as a protected attribute. In some jurisdictions, they have trade union activity. Why should you be discriminated against because you worked in a trade union? Irrelevant criminal records. A socio-economic disadvantage. Why should you be discriminated against? So I think there's a lot of room to move in the future, and I think that will be a great initiative for the state, and good work is yet to be done, good work having been done 50 years ago.
Chris.
Yeah, well, I'd agree with all of that, and just observe in passing that 1994, just before I resigned from Parliament and after the Bannon government was defeated, I moved a motion in the Legislative Council to set up a select committee to look at a whole lot of constitutional issues, and one of which was a Human Rights Act, which after I left, it has to be said, and it wasn't just because I left, but it has to be said that the period of interest in human rights and the things that were around in the Dunstan years and the Whitlam years and even through the Hawke years dropped off within South Australia through probably both Liberal and Labor governments, I think it's fair to say. So not very much has been done about these areas.
We've rested on our laurels.
And I would agree with what the two previous speakers have said. It's time to have another look at things. A Human Rights Act would be an important matter to proceed with. So I agree with that. But can I just come back to one other thing that I should have said previously about Peter Duncan's bill? Peter Duncan's bill was not just a reflection of the Wolfenden Committee recommendations, although the decriminalisation was the primary focus of it. As Ian has suggested, in passing it, it went broader than that, and it equalised the offences in relation to homosexuals and heterosexuals. So there was that sort of equality across the board. And in doing that, that was very innovative, and I think innovative in world terms, or at least in Westminster terms. It wasn't followed in the UK until very much later. One thing that is worth observing, however, is that Don Dunstan and Peter Duncan, although they were receiving recommendations from the then Equal Opportunity Commissioner to make sexual orientation grounds not to be discriminated against in the Equal Opportunity Act or in the Sex Discrimination Act as it was at the time, they didn't act on that, which probably indicates the sensitivity of the topic, the political sensitivity of the topic. And it wasn't until 1984 in the Bannon government, when I was Attorney General, we set up a review of the Sex Discrimination Act and the legislative structure for equal opportunity and introduced the 1984 Act, which is still in place, interesting enough. And in that, prohibited discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation in employment, provision of services, accommodation.
And if I can, I just want to clarify that I'm actually agnostic on a Human Rights Act because I think this state has been very well served by the Equal Opportunity Act, and the priority is to review that. As I said earlier, in the course of a review, consideration could be given to a Human Rights Act, but an effective an effective equal opportunity and anti-vilification framework would do the trick, in my view. And interestingly, that was one of the 136 recommendations made in Natasha Stott-Despoja's recent report about DV. So I don't think you necessarily need to get from 0 to 100. I think you can, as long as we get up to about 70 or 80, then...
No, go for 120.
Well, sure, but change does come slowly. Seems to be slower these days than it was in the 60s or 70s.
If you don't ask, you don't get.
True. In any case, reform of the Act will serve everyone well, I think. We'll see.
Thank you very much, colleagues. We are at time. I think it's, I want to thank you all for your attendance. I mean, South Australia, historically was known for fine wines, making cars and law reform. We've got to get back to at least two of those three. I want to thank our political leaders and our statutory officers here who've been involved, but I also want to note the community members. I mean, this was a moment in time when I think the community and its leadership came together. We should be proud of that moment, but we should also know there's work to be done. Colleagues, thank you very much for your attendance here tonight.